Today, I'd like to do a review of Seiko's first wristwatch chronographs, the 5717 and the 5719. After that, I'll briefly discuss the very rare 5718. But before we get to that, let's talk about the history behind these watches. Now, these were released in 1964. 1964 was important because the Olympics were being held at Tokyo, and for the few years prior to that, Seiko was hard at work coming up with different timing devices for sports. Among the things released were these watches, and the first thing you notice is it's a one-button chronograph, which in and of itself is pretty rare in the watch world, back then and now. While I think it looks much nicer and more elegant than a two-button chronograph, manufacturers, I guess, never felt that way because very few have really been released from 64 to now. The way it works is pretty simple. The first button, first of all, this is a second totalizer, not a minute totalizer, so it's nothing to get excited about. But again, this is 1964 technology. So when you first press it, the second totalizer starts moving. When you press it the second time, it stops, and third time resets it. So basically, a one-button chronograph does the function of two. So start-stop would be normal, and then a pusher at 4 o'clock would usually do the reset, but that's designated to the 2 o'clock pusher as well. Really elegant design. And as I said before, this is a second totalizer. So it's nothing as nice as a minute totalizer that in a later Lamania chronograph. But again, 1964. You'll also notice that these watches have rotating bezels with 60-minute designations. The point behind this, these are not dive watches. These are only 30-meter water-resistant watches. The idea is you have the power to time things within minutes with the 60-minute bezel, excuse me, and you can time things to in seconds with this second-hand chronograph. And that was useful for timing sporting events at the Olympics in 1964. And that's the historical setting in which these watches appeared. Now, they came in different variations. Now, to my knowledge, the 5717 date version never used luminous paint on the dial or hands. That's my understanding, though there were different bezel versions released, but always metal. The tricky thing is the 5719. Now, the 5719 originally came with a plastic bezel, actually this very bezel. Now, the problem is that the early bezels were very flimsy and broke apart. So eventually Seiko started producing metal bezels for the 5719 in different versions. Now, when I purchased this a while ago from Japan, it came with a very worn plastic bezel that had cracked. I paid through the nose to get a new old stock one, and even though it's in really great condition, I really don't like rotating it at all because it's still sort of flimsy. My advice to you, if you're considering buying a 5719 for functionality, is to get one with a later metal bezel. Now, that being said, even when the metal bezel had a black insert, I still think it doesn't match the look quite like this plastic bezel. So basically, the choice is either get a plastic bezel that's sort of flimsy, but looks, I think, better, or a later metal bezel that's more functional and that you could rotate it safely, but doesn't look quite as interesting as the plastic one. That is ultimately up to you. Now, these are hand-wind watches, and again, this one has luminous paint on the hands and the dial. They came in black versions as well, and there were some different commemorative versions on top of that. Now, when you rotate them, they had different engravings. Now, some of them had seahorse engravings, which I believe is representative of the 30-meter water resistance. That's here. And they're thin engravings, so you can't always see. And this one is a Olympic torch, which I hope can be seen. And that was for the 1964 Olympics. There were other versions made. At the very least, I know there's a Nissan Skyline version that commemorated, well, the Nissan Skyline. So it's a little tricky. Different ones have different engravings, and that's basically it. One other thing, the crystals are acrylic, and obviously in this case the crystal is in really good condition. Crystals aren't terribly difficult to acquire. I made the mistake of putting on the new plastic bezel before I switched out the very badly damaged crystal on this one, though, which is a mistake because it's going to have to be removed before you can replace the crystal. Oh well. And even though, again, it's basically the same watch, They look quite different, especially when you look at the 5719 in its original guise of the black plastic bezel. And from an aesthetic perspective, this one looks, I guess, more modern, and this one looks a bit more antiquated. And that's up to you as the collector if you happen to be interested in them. But both can easily be worn in modern times without it looking too small. And the lugs are 18 millimeters, so I think they're like aftermarket third-party bracelets that are very similar, like the beads of rice that these were initially worn on. So there's also that to consider. So there are different ways you can bring them back to what they roughly looked like in 1964, as far as third-party bezels and at least the plastic one, and third-party bracelet. With that being said, with these two, let's move on to the 5718. And here we have the mythical 5718. For the longest time, people in the West really didn't know anything about this watch, and the few pictures that were available were really confusing because people wondered what on earth this window was. The number was always different, 57, 62, 27. There were people speculating that it was some funky day counter that would rotate once every 24 hours. No one had any idea. Not too long ago, some Western collectors took enough interest in these watches to start acquiring them too. And that's no mean feat because they usually go for 10 to 20,000 US at least. So that requires quite a commitment, but slowly but surely its function was figured out. And the reality is it's not that fancy. Now I'll remind you again what the basic 57, 17, and 19 can do. They can time up to 60 minutes with a rotating bezel, and they can time things to within a second. Also, this 17 has a date. Now this watch does things differently. Now this is a start-stop chrono for this, and this is a reset. I'm sorry, this is a start-stop button, and this is a reset button. They control this subdial at 6 o'clock. Now there are two hands. One is just a regular running 60-second hand, and that just is always running. The other hand is actuated by the start-stop, and that does 60 minutes on this subdial. So if you can time maximally 60 minutes on the subdial, and you have the same second hand as here that can time things to within seconds. So the interesting thing is this basically is a more advanced version or an advanced way of doing what this can do. This can time things in minutes and in seconds up to 60 minutes, and this can time things in minutes and seconds up to 60 minutes. This is a lower tech version because here you're rotating a bezel, but for the most part, it can accomplish the same thing. And that tells us what the right side does. Now, the left side mystery is a lot less complicated than everyone thought. Now, you have two pushers here. One pusher just moves the wheel here by one number. So every time you push it, it'll go from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8, and the other one will do the other number. So this is just basically some sort of lap counter, a mechanical lap counter that you manually have to adjust. And it's an interesting implementation of it, but in the 70s, there were watches that were able to do, sort of like gimmick watches, that were able to do counts of like tennis scores and golf scores with similar manual pushers. Now, sure, this is an interesting way of doing it, but if you break it down at its very core, this, aside from the lap counting, which is really basically an irrelevant function, the timing mechanism to count up to 60 minutes is the same here and here. There might be a little bit more accuracy in that it's easier to press a button than to rotate the bezel, but for the most part, they basically can accomplish the same function. And that, to me, was interesting. I mean, in retrospect, since the movement is the same, it's obvious that in 1964, this wasn't going to be some high-tech thing that could accomplish something just miles above this. So that really is the mystery of the 5718. Not quite that much more advanced. And interestingly enough, this also came out in around 64. And this had a 60-minute totalizer. About a decade later, Seiko released its 7016 caliber that has not only a 60-minute totalizer at 6 o'clock, but a 12-hour totalizer at 6 o'clock as well. Now, to my knowledge, these two movements aren't related, but the function, which is very specific, is. And again, as I said before, these are very rare and very expensive, and I think they go for 10 to 20 plus thousand US. And historically, it's a fascinating watch, and it looks great, especially like from this angle here. But again, outside of the lap timer, it really basically can accomplish the same thing the much more basic 57, 17, and 19 can do. And hey, the 5717 even has a date wheel on top of it. And here we have a comparison between the original 5719 and 5717 to the commemorative reissue chronograph that Seiko did in 2004. I believe they called it their 40th anniversary tribute to these watches. And I don't know if you're familiar, but the 9082 kinetic chronographs were traditionally bulky, pretty loud, like black and orange loud colors. So it was sort of, well, unique, if nothing else, that Seiko released a very toned down version of it as a tribute to these two watches. And that obviously the aesthetic is the same. They use the 5719 hands. And it's sort of an interesting tribute, except for the fact that it was probably the worst possible module to use for a tribute to that watch, because it has really complicated dials and sub-dials, and even though they try to disguise everything by doing the little black fake bezel and everything, it really comes across as sort of being the opposite of elegant in just about every way possible. And not surprisingly, the value isn't too great. I think maybe you can buy it for about 1,000 US. But in general, the 90 kinetic chronographs aren't terribly popular. But I did think it was important enough to reference it for this particular video. Just one last thing, I just wanted to show exactly what I mean when I say that the chronographs for the 60s were really understated. When you go into the 70s, you realize Seiko, like most other watch manufacturers, really started going far out as far as their shapes and colors. So especially when you look at the browns and the blues and purples and things like that came out in the 70s, really makes you realize just how special and elegant these watches from the 60s were. Anyway, that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.